Hello and welcome. My name is Shel Carlson. I'm the head of data science strategy and evangelism here at Domino, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Reid Blackman. Reid Blackman is the founder, CEO of Virtue Consultants. He is the author of the book Ethical Machines. He is a former professor of philosophy over at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and Colgate. And currently, I would say he's the only person that I would trust on the topic of responsible AI. So thank you very much. Reid, pleasure having you here.
I don't know if me being the only person you trust says a lot about me or your limited knowledge of people, or that you don't know enough people.
It might say something about what I think of the other people.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Just
right.
Maybe.
All right, well, thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So I'm going to try the best that I can to explain to you how you actually put AI ethics into practice and what it needs to look like. As Shel mentioned, I was a former philosophy professor. I guess I still am a former philosophy professor. I'm not now a professor. And one of the liabilities is that we think about everything in an argument. What's the argument? And so I'm going to give you an argument that I'm going to structure this whole talk around. And I'm going to give you the whole argument now, premise by premise, and then we're going to go into each premise, each claim that I'm going to make. So the first is that there are certain ethical and reputational risks that are probable by virtue of how AI or ML works. I'm just going to use AI, ML interchangeably. So there's certain ethical and reputational risks that are probable, they're likely, by virtue of the beast that is machine learning. It's the nature of the beast to increase the probability of a certain subset of ethical risks being realized. That said, number two, many AI ethical risks are use case specific. What are you using it for? There are dangerous ways or dangerous contexts in which you might use AI, and we need to be cognizant of those ethical risks as well. Number three, ethical risk assessments require qualitative elements. Obviously, this is a sort of data science conference. I want to stress data science is great. It's just not enough in all circumstances. There are crucial qualitative judgments that need to be made. In some cases, having data scientists in the room is absolutely appropriate. It's not always the case, although it may sometimes be the case, that they're the only ones who should be in the room, as I'll talk about in a bit. Our methodology for identifying and mitigating ethical risks must accommodate 1 through 3. And again, I'm going to go through each one of these in more detail. So this is just sort of the overview. And so finally, the conclusion, and yes, I'm using conclusion for those of you who are fans of logic and want a valid proof. This is not quite that, but the reasonable conclusion to draw is that organizations that will leverage AI to stay competitive and grow need to proactively address these risks before they hurt people and brands. Okay, let's start with number one. Certain things are likely. Now, I'm going to zoom out so you get a grip on how I'm thinking about the AI ethics landscape. And this is how I think about it. You'll notice that the first distinction I make is between what lots of people call AI for good and what I call AI for not bad. The AI for good people ask the question, how do we create positive social impact using the powerful tool that is AI? For those of you who like talking about the UN's Sustainability Development Goals, or the SDGs, you might ask, how do we pursue those SDGs using the powerful tool that is AI? So explicit, if you like, these people are explicitly aiming for ethical goals, ethically good impact. That's great. People should go do that. I don't do that. I think that corporations, government for that matter, should focus on AI for not bad. AI for not bad is, all right, look, we're going to do what we're going to do, with some exceptions. Maybe we'll have ethical qualms about certain kinds of goals. But for the most part, we've got these perfectly ethically acceptable or ethically neutral, certainly not ethically bad, business goals. We want to pursue them using the powerful tool that is AI. And we want to do it in a way that's not ethically, reputationally, regulatorily, or legally problematic. We don't want it to go off the guardrails. So this is AI for not bad. I think AI for not bad should be prioritized both from an ethics perspective and from a business perspective. Ethical principle number one, if there is, first do no harm. And from a business perspective, you need to prioritize not wronging people at scale or harming people at scale over a particular project that creates positive social impact. And I should say, and we talked about this, I talked about this with Shel earlier, when AI, it's the it's the purpose of AI to scale, right? You want to use AI precisely because it can scale various kinds of decisions or operations. And so when you realize an ethical risk, when something ethically when it goes off the rails, ethically speaking, you do it at scale. You don't just hurt that one person. You hit a giant population of people. So I like to focus on AI for not bad. You can also put it slightly differently, which is AI ethical risk mitigation. And here I'm saying AI ethical risk mitigation. It's sort of shorthand for AI ethical, reputational, regulatory, and legal risk mitigation. So that's the focus. That's my focus, and I think it should be the focus of businesses as well. OK. The next distinction that you'll see is between content and structure. The content side of the house, so to speak, asks the question, what are the ethical risks we're trying to avoid, and what are their sources? What are the ethical risks we're trying to avoid, and what are their sources? The structure side of the house asks, and how do we do it? How do we actually, organizationally, identify and mitigate those risks, ideally in a systematic and comprehensive way? So what are the risks, and what are their sources? That's the content side. And how do we stop things from going off the rails? That's the structure side. Now, I mostly think that people think about the content side very superficially. We see headlines, biased AI, privacy violations, black box models are really scary, killed someone with a car. And then they run to, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, how do we fix it? And in my estimation, that's too quick. It's too quick because you can't build a good structure. You can't do well on, if you like, the governance side of things. So structure is governance, policies, processes, workflow, tools, training, upskilling, et cetera, et cetera. You can't do that stuff well. You can't build an effective AI ethical risk program within an organization unless you understand the content side more deeply. In some ways, what I'm saying, frankly, is totally superficial. I'm just saying if you don't really understand your problem, you can't come up with a really good solution. Unfortunately, though, in the AI ethics space, for some reason, it's typically left at a very high level of bias bad. Let's stop that. And you got to go a lot deeper than that if you're going to have effective risk mitigation strategies. When I talk about the content side of AI/ML, using them interchangeably, you'll see that I've mentioned three in particular here. There's explainable AI, which, black box AI, there's fair and unbiased AI, and there are privacy violations. Now, why do I point these three out when there's all sorts of ways? Like I didn't, for instance, mention you can kill people with self-driving cars here. Why are these three an essential part of the landscape? The reason is that these three are very likely just given how ML works. What is machine learning? It's software that learns by example. Now, that's what I usually say to non-technologists, because I like to even avoid the word data with non-technologists because it tends to scare them. So it's software that learns by example, and if you want a fancy word for example, you can use the word data. It's software that learns by data. What is it doing with all that data? As this audience knows well, it's recognizing patterns in that data. And those patterns can be so phenomenally complex. They can be tracking the mathematical relations of thousands of variables and the thousands of mathematical relations among those variables that we can't understand that pattern. And so we have the black box problem. Right? It's the nature of, say, deep neural networks to recognize complex patterns that are so complex, in fact, that they defy human understanding. And so it's the nature of how machine learning works that we get the black box problem. In some cases, the patterns that it recognizes could be discriminatory in nature or might reflect certain kinds of biases. So for instance, if you've got some hiring software or some resume reading software, perhaps in your training data, it reflects that women weren't hired so much around here for a variety of reasons, some discriminatory, some not. And then it takes that bias or discriminatory pattern, it repeats it, it scales it, you get all else equal of a discriminatory AI. So again, it's the nature of the beast of AI to recognize patterns. In many instances, or lots of cases, those patterns can be discriminatory in nature, which is why we start talking about biased AI in so many circumstances. And again, it's going to scale it, right? It's going to do it really fast. It's not like you just discriminated against, one hiring manager discriminated against these 5 applicants. It's our AI software discriminated when it was going through these 100,000 applications. A bit more problematic. The privacy stuff is also built into how ML works in at least two ways. Number one, the fuel of machine learning is data. All else equal, the more data you have, the better the ML is going to be, the more accurate it's going to be. And oftentimes what it's making predictions about, or the output, is about people. So you need data about people. So if you're in the business of training a model that's going to make certain kinds of predictions about people, say a risk rating for a credit application, your organization is thereby highly incentivized to collect as much data about people as possible, because all else equal, the more data you have, the more likely you're going to get an accurate AI. So since it's the fuel, you want a bunch of fuel, go get a bunch of data. There's another way, though, in which we get privacy violations. What are a lot of models doing? They're making predictions about people. And in some cases, while the data, the training data, the possession of that does not constitute a violation of privacy, the inferred data constitutes a violation of privacy. So to take an example, let's suppose for the sake of argument that I don't know, you're a telecommunications company and you're allowed to have my geolocation data. You sort of know where I'm going throughout New York City. You also have, let's say, just another data set that pertains to the addresses of cancer treatment centers. You throw those into your AI, a bit more complicated than that, as you well know, but you start noticing, or the AI notices, so to speak, that Reid goes to this address at 3:30 every Wednesday. It's the address of a cancer treatment center, therefore Reid probably has cancer. And let's suppose it's not true. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that's true. Certainly, at a minimal, arguably, while not having any of that training data itself constitute a violation of my privacy, the new piece of data that you've inferred from that using our AI itself constitutes a violation of privacy. So again, because AI is a thing that learns by lots of data, it's often data about people, often making inferences about people, you get a high likelihood of privacy violations with AI. So that's why I highlight those three. That was the infographic that I had up until, December, January. And then this happened, as everybody knows. And people are probably already familiar with this. Because of the way that generative AI works, and I'm thinking a little bit more in terms of LLMs than I am, say, picture and video, but those are included, we get even more content issues. So it's the nature of the beast that is going to get trained on people's intellectual property. It's a variation of a privacy violation. You're going to get hallucinations because it's not a truth tracking model. Right? It's a language model, not a knowledge model. So it's quite likely that you're going to get, it's basically a guarantee, you're going to get hallucinations. Now maybe there are strategies, there are some cool things sort of in the works that have been announced relatively lately about how to solve for this, but you're going to get hallucinations because you've got something that is not built to track truth. And so you get hallucinations, false claims, et cetera. Personally, one of my favorite things about the unfolding of all this is, remember when people were demanding citations? And then it started giving citations, and all the citations were made up too? I just thought that was kind of funny. And then you get what I call the problem of shared responsibility. Now, I'll stress that this is not unique to generative AI. It just seems to me particularly exacerbated in the case of generative AI. OpenAI does their thing, or Microsoft does their thing, or Google does their thing, et cetera. Then it goes to the downstream developers in your organization. Maybe it's you. You start fine-tuning it. You deploy it. It totally goes ethically off the rails. Who's responsible? It's not totally clear. On the one hand, they built the foundational model. On the other hand, you fine-tuned it. It's not totally clear who's responsible, which is really important because if it does go off the rails, then your CEO comes to you and say, what did you do? This thing went totally off the rails. We just, clearly, our chatbot went on a racist rant. What have you done? Or something along those lines. There's a really there's a philosophical question about how do we distribute responsibility, but there's just also a practical, if you like, pragmatic business case or business question. How do we know that we have enough information from, say, OpenAI, to do sufficient due diligence on the model such that if we fine-tune it and things go sideways, it's on us rather than it's on them? And organizations like OpenAI are a bit cagey with a lot of information, like what their training data looks like. And so it's going to be an empirical question. Have the builders of the foundational models given us enough information such that we can do our due diligence? Or not. If not, we need to go ask them for more information so that we can do our due diligence to avoid those risks. If they have, now it's on you. But probably that's going to be on a use case by use case basis, whether we have enough information for this particular use case to do our sufficient risk identification. But you're getting this problem, again, you get it in other kinds of cases as well. You pull a model off the shelf, you still have this problem of shared responsibility, but it seems to be worth highlighting because now it's really gone, the volume has turned up on it, I think. Okay. That was that. That was just number one. The other ones I'll run through quicker, so don't panic. I'll stop talking eventually. Certain ethical risks are a problem by virtue of how AI or ML works. Let's move on to the next one. Many AI ethical risks are use case specific. It's not the nature of the beast of machine learning, it's the purposes to which you put the beast that is the problem. Lots of use cases. Diagnoses and prescriptions in healthcare. People are already, when I say people, doctors, nurses, are already using GPT 4.0 for differential diagnoses. They're not supposed to, but they're doing it. It's happening now. This was, I want to say it wasn't only predictable, it was predicted, but sometimes you roll the dice, apparently. But this is happening right now. People are using it to diagnose patients. Although we have extremely little, not extremely little, but let's just say insufficient testing for how reliable this is in a variety of contexts, different races, different ethnicities, different genders, different ages, et cetera, et cetera. So literally life and death here when we're talking about use case specific risk. Killing pedestrians with self-driving cars, I mentioned that one. Risk ratings in financial services, insurance, criminal justice. Right? Again, it's not because of the nature of the beast of AI, it's because you are choosing to use it in a very high-risk circumstance. Denying someone a mortgage, denying someone insurance, convicting someone, or giving them a very long sentence as opposed to a short sentence, deciding whether or not, as everyone probably knows, the famous machine learning bias in the criminal justice system from the ProPublica article in 2016, I think. Giving, say, black people high risk ratings instead of lower risk ratings, just holding all other variables constant. So high stakes circumstances, or deploying AI in high stakes circumstances means high risk. Okay. Other kinds of cases, unjustified arrests of military applications, various kinds of surveillance technology, so they're the privacy monster raises its head again. Inadequate communication to relevant stakeholders on how the tech actually works, right? Data scientists might have a really good grip on it, and they know how to use it well and responsibly. If it's not appropriately communicated to the downstream user, ethical risks can be realized in all sorts of ways. And then there's high-risk deployment by distracted, tired, undertrained, and frankly, underbrained personnel who just don't know how to use the thing well. So all sorts of cases in which you have use case-based ethical risks. Thus, number two. Moving right along. Ethical risk assessments require qualitative elements. I cannot tell you how important I think this point is. Well, I'll try. So let me give you some example. What's the appropriate metric for fair and unbiased? So many of you are familiar with the fact that a lot of ML is, say, distributing some good or service. Let's say it's giving out mortgages or something along those lines. And you give out, you approve and you deny mortgages or insurance or whatever it is across a giant population. And then you ask, have we distributed this fairly across these various subpopulations, race, gender, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera? Have we distributed it fairly? And so what do? Well, you go to the machine learning ethics literature, and you find these metrics for what constitutes a fair distribution. And you say, well, how did we do on that metric? Or how do we do on these metrics? And it turns out, and this is assuming that this is the right approach, and there's reasons for it, we can talk about it in Q&A if you want, but there's reasons for thinking that there are many cases where asking what's the appropriate metric is not even the right question to begin with. But even if it is the case, you can't score well on all of these metrics at the same time. There are something like 24+ metrics for fairness. They're mutually incompatible, so scoring well on some entails necessarily scoring poorly on others. What that means is that you're left with this substantive, qualitative, ethical, reputational, business question. What's the appropriate metric for fairness for this particular use case? Or, as I prefer to put it, which ones do we know are the inappropriate metrics for fairness for this particular use case? And then of the set of appropriate ones, let's just choose an appropriate one that is compatible with maximal accuracy or something along those lines. But that question, what's the appropriate metric or what are the inappropriate ones, from an ethical, reputational, regulatory, legal, business perspective, is a qualitative decision. You don't do a mathematical formula to figure out what's the appropriate one. And then, of course, one question is, who should make the judgment about what the appropriate metric for fairness is? With all due respect to the data scientists in the room, data scientists generally don't have the appropriate training to choose what's the appropriate from an ethical, reputational, business, et cetera, perspective about what's the appropriate metric. So there needs to be other people in the room. What counts as a good explanation and for whom? There's all sorts of people who need explanations. Data scientists like tools like Lyman and Shap. It, let's suppose for the sake of argument, really does give them insight into how the model works. It really is simplification without distortion. Let's just say that's the case. Maybe it's not. But other kinds of users need different kinds of explanations. Regulators need different kinds of explanations. And you can't just hand over some Lyme report. They don't do that. They don't read that. Who should have control over the data? So we talked about privacy. People, it's sort of popular in the press or social media maybe to talk about that's my data. You're collecting my data. I should have control over my data. Now, I actually don't think it's their data. There's a very quick move from data about me to my data, some ownership claim. So I think more needs to be said there. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But there's a substantive question about who should have control over the data. Should it be us or them, for instance? Should it be our organization or should it be the users? Is our chatbot objectionably manipulative? This one actually scares me quite a bit. Train up your chatbot to be a phenomenal negotiator, right? You tell it to read all the negotiation books. You can't do this quite yet, but tell it to read all the negotiation books, tell it to read all the sales books, tell it to read all the books about how you manipulate people, how you stoke fear, and use that as a kind of customer-facing salesperson that manipulates users in various ways that they're not aware of. And one day they're selling you sneakers, and maybe the next day they're selling you the conspiracy theory. It's a bit frightening in my estimation. I mean, you're not going to know the quote-unquote intentions of the chatbot. What you really won't know are the intentions of the people who built or fine-tuned the model, what they're trying to get you to do. But is it I should say, there's also reasonable incentives. Right? If I say, look, I'll give you $10 if you jump up and down and walk like a chicken. I haven't manipulated you. If you do it, I've given you arguably a reasonable incentive. So there are some ways of getting people to do things that are more or less reasonable, and some things are objectionably manipulative. Some things are positively undermining of people's autonomy. The question is, where is that line? That's a qualitative decision. What's the appropriate benchmark for safe deployment? This is going to vary by use case, but again, it's not a math decision. Do we need human deliberators, or can we defer to the AI's quote-unquote judgment? Under what conditions do we need, or is it appropriate, or is it optimal, or is it interfering to have a human in the loop? And sometimes it's not good, right? Humans are, they're not very bright, generally. We make lots of mistakes, so sometimes it's not going to be appropriate to have a human in the loop. In a military context, you might not have time to have a human in the loop because there are real-time decisions being made about what's going on in the battlefield, and if the opposition just has their AI running, and you've got, Gilbert, like, maybe, there's no time for that. Does this place an undue burden on the user? Not, again, a math question. It's a qualitative ethical decision. Is this our responsibility or the users or the government's? OK. So where are we? We've done that. It's the nature of the beast that certain ethical risks are quite likely. That said, many ethical risks are quite likely. And we cannot ignore the qualitative elements to ethical risk identification and mitigation. And so however we're going to do this, however we're going to mitigate those risks, it's going to have to accommodate numbers 1 through 3. Let's look a little bit about that. Look at that a little bit. Our methodology is going to have to accommodate the various kinds of ethical risks we've discussed. In fact, it has to accommodate, from my perspective anyway, the set of all ethical risks. It has to be flexible enough to accommodate unforeseen applications, because you don't know what, you might know your use cases for today, maybe even the next 6 months from now. Actually, you probably don't with LLMs. You don't know what people are going to propose tomorrow, let alone today. But it's going to have to be flexible to accommodate unforeseen applications. One thing that I haven't mentioned, or at least not explicitly, is that it's going to have to articulate the stakeholders who will suffer from those realized risks. And there's going to have to be some way of providing some way of prioritizing those ethical risks. Murdering people worse than a paper cut. Here's a sort of toy example of what that looks like. Along the top, you'll see categories of ethical risk. This is the way that I have sliced up the world of ethical risk. There's other ways. I'm less concerned that people or organizations have this exact list, so long as however they chop up, if you like, the ethical risk pie, it's comprehensive, that it covers the set of all ethical risks. You'll notice, by the way, that I put things like privacy and explainability and bias as subsets of broader ethical concerns. So for instance, in the sort of justice category, you certainly do want to care about discriminatory models, but you might have other kinds of concerns as they relate to justice, and you don't want to miss out on those. One of them, although it's not obvious that most corporations will care that much, but you might care about what wealth inequality looks like, and you might want to make sure that you don't build products that exacerbate existing wealth inequalities. Maybe you don't, maybe they're okay with that, but it's important, I think, to see that the issue of bias or discriminatory models is a subset of all issues pertaining to justice. Along the left, richly articulated stakeholders, A, B, C, and D. And then, of course, you see sort of risk ratings, if you like, red, green, yellow. Again, this is a toy example. This is not a, this is just to sort of drive the point across. You're going to have to tie those colors to some actual action. It can't just be, this is bad, but does this mean that it goes to an ethics committee? Does this mean that we completely stop? What do these risk ratings mean? And again, that's a toy example, but this is a real example. And this is actually a zoomed in version. You're not going to be able to read it. You can take the picture, but I don't know. Anyway, this is a part of a much larger risk matrix that we did for a multinational client, where there's lots of different categories of risk and ways of assessing it. And you also have to customize these risk matrices to how you already do enterprise risk mitigation. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And also, who's the matrix for? You don't want to give the same matrix to a data scientist that you're going to give to someone in the C-suite. But I just want to give you a sense of things can get quite complicated. One of the things that you can't see, by the way, maybe if you peered really closely, you'd see that it's broken up by phase of the AI lifecycle, because the risk assessment has to go on throughout the AI lifecycle, from conception to build, to testing and validating, to deployment, to retiring the model. After you've done your ethical risk assessment, plus other kinds of things like a feasibility analysis and how well the solution solves the problems, you still have to determine the appropriate risk mitigation strategies, risk mitigation tools. By the way, this says, for those that enable quantitative analyses, I'm stressing the importance of qualitative assessments. By no means do I think that you don't need the quantitative. Of course, you need the quantitative, and there are better and worse tools for this sort of thing. You need to identify what the benchmarks are for sufficiently de-risked. And of course, you need to ask who determines which tools, strategies, and benchmarks. Incidentally, this is one place in which I might call it something like non-ethical bias creeps in, because it's just the same person every time for the last 10 years who's been choosing the tools. They're going to have certain kinds of blind spots, ethical or otherwise. And so, that's one way in which you get bias creeping into the overall system. OK. We've seen these. I've just sort of, started talking about what the methodology is. That's at a relatively granular level. But now let's zoom out a little bit. Here's the conclusion based on all the things that I've said. Organizations need to proactively address these risks. And frankly, especially with the advent of LLMs, the proactive bit is sort of not really there anymore. It would have been proactive, but I think now that most anyone in your organization, unless you shut it down, can access large language models, the time for being proactive is now. We're on our way towards reactive if we're not there already. Let's talk about this a little bit. You'll remember this infographic that blew your mind. There's the content side and the structure side. And the structure stuff was, how do we do it? And we've already started getting into that stuff with the risk matrix, right? But let's talk a little bit more about what the structure looks like, how to create it. I think of these things in terms of 7 ingredients of AI governance. I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through the first few. Set your standards with an AI ethics statement. Big warning, most companies do this completely wrong. They have a statement. It says we're for fairness, we're for transparency, we're for accountability. And then that's it. That's the end of the statement, and no one knows what to do with it. And then they say, how do we operationalize this? And they say, oh, ethics isn't operationalizable. And then they just give up. But that's because the statements are bad. I can talk more about how to write a good AI ethics statement. The core of it, though, is that you're not allowed to say that you value X without saying what that means is off the table. Because we value X, we will never Y. We will always Z. So to take a sort of very simple example, we value privacy, and that means we will never sell our user data to a third party, as an example. If you have, you can't just say, for instance, we're for transparency, because no one is transparent about everything with everyone, nor should they be. So as a start, you create, your ethics statement is about your ethical guardrails. If you have, 5 or 6 values or principles, whatever you want to call them, transparency, accountability, privacy, safety, whatever, and you have, let's say, 3 to 7 we will never X's in light of those values, you've now got, call it 35-ish guardrails of action. That seems pretty operationalizable to me. Next, and this is in some ways sort of obvious, but it gets skipped over a lot, unfortunately. People want to write their statement, and then they want to implement. You can't implement yet. You've got to do some kind of gap and feasibility analysis. You have to get a grip on where your organization is now relative to where your statement says you want to be. What existing governance structures do we have? What are the existing policies look like? What does the existing educational resources look like? The training, the upskilling, the onboarding? What does the workflow look like now? What tools are we using now? Who do we have working for us? If you don't do this, things go haywire. And it must be cross-functional. It can't be just the data scientists who are doing this. You got to bring in people from risk, from compliance. One client that I worked with, financial services company, Fortune 500, and they were sort of doing this in isolation, and then when their existing model risk governance got wind of it, they were like, wait, what, you doing what? Wait, how are you thinking about risk? What? No good. Those people should have been in the room from the start to help do this gap and feasibility analysis to see how far are we away from where we need to be, and crucially, what existing resources do we have that we can leverage to push an AI ethical risk program forward. So for instance, if you've already got some sort of robust risk board with a proper jurisdiction, blah, 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 then maybe you just augment that existing board, and that becomes your, among other things, AI ethical risk board. There's different ways of doing this. It varies by organization. But you've got to do the gap and feasibility analysis because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for every organization. It's got to get woven into existing infrastructure, policies, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when you start designing a strategic roadmap, a framework. That's going to include policies, procedures. And are you going to use existing enterprise risk categories, or are you going to have new risk categories that are specific to our AI teams, our data science teams? And if so, how do we get those two to talk to each other if they're going to be different categories? And what does escalation look like, et cetera, QA, QI, processing, auditing, et cetera. And then one other crucial thing, and then I'll sort of move on, is you've got to have metrics and KPIs. I never thought I would say this as a former academic philosopher, but they're really crucial. I mean, when you're talking about scaling a program across an enterprise, tracking what people are doing with various kinds of AI models, not just those that you design in-house, but also those you procure, whether it's through an official procurement process or someone just got onto Bing and started using GPT 4.0, you need metrics and KPIs for tracking the program. That's going to include tracking, for instance, the extent to which the program is rolled out, the extent to which people are compliant with that program, and the actual impact of that program. And you'll have to look at other things as well, step-by-step implementation playbook, processes, impact assessment. Okay. At a super high level, strategic board and C-suite considerations, ideally an AI ethical risk program is tied into enterprise-wide AI strategies, not something that you sort of like do later. It's also harmonized with other kinds of metrics and KPIs. So your organization already has lots of business and operational metrics. There are ESG metrics. There might be DEI metrics. And ideally, the AI ethical risk program is woven into these things as well. So it's woven into the entire organization. You need an ongoing assessment of AI operations. And then one thing that people don't often think about is what are their standards for partnerships, strategic or otherwise. People also don't think about mergers and acquisitions. Before we, as part of our due diligence for our mergers and acquisitions process, do we do an ethical risk analysis of the models that they're using? Do we even get an inventory? Then do we do an analysis of what kinds of models they're using and what kind of due diligence they've done? Or are we actually just going to onboard a tremendous amount of risk because we're acquiring this company that hasn't been paying attention to this stuff? Because they were a startup, they wanted to scale, they wanted to sell to your company, and so they just sort of didn't do it. Okay, some final comments about where to go from here. One, I think it's always crucial to have a cross-functional working group. I always say whoever brings us in, it's usually something like chief information officer, chief technology officer. You need risk, compliance, cyber, HR. You need those people in the room. Executive education is crucial. There's so many people who speak AI differently. As I'm sure you know, the way that you in this room think about AI or ML, let alone AI ethical risks, is different from the way your, say, CEO thinks about it. It's just a different, they just don't speak that language in many cases. Getting that cross-functional education and alignment is crucial. Otherwise, it stays really siloed within an organization if it gets rolled out at all. Then you start building your structure. Two things I'll say here. There's the informal approach and the formal approach. What a lot of organizations are doing right now, and this is not me blaming them, this is actually, in a sense, me praising them, it's the quick and dirty approach, at least for now. Most organizations were caught off guard by LLMs, for instance. They're not really sure what to do, so they're throwing together ways of educating their employees across the enterprise about the dangers of LLM and how to use it responsibly. Some are just trying to get a grip on what the inventory looks like, and you're making sure that people know that if they start using it in some way, it needs to be reported with the appropriate channels to get an inventory. And maybe there's some kind of, I'll talk about this later actually at my keynote, there's some way for those non-data scientist employees to see whether there's some ethical smoke here. And then there's someone to whom they can say, hey, listen, I smell smoke. There's an alarm to pull, so to speak, and some kind of advisory board that can help them. It's not particularly systematic. It's not top-down. It's not comprehensive. But it's something. And even though, to quote one of my clients from yesterday, it's not the case that we have any fires right now, right today, but everyone is now holding a flamethrower. That's what makes us nervous. So a quick and dirty approach as an opening move to the formal approach makes a lot of sense. And the formal approach is what I was talking about earlier, where you have a statement, and then you do the gap analysis, and then you create a customized framework. All that stuff is great, but frankly, probably unless you've completely shut down access to generative AI in your organization, you probably should just at least start with the quick and dirty approach, the informal approach, on your way to a more formal approach. So that's where I'm going to end. You should now, I hope, be able to sort of see what I call the landscape of AI ethics. I think there should be a focus on risk mitigation. Let's not go off the ethical guardrails. We need to understand the kinds of risks that we're talking about at a deep level. And once we understand not just what those risks are, but what their real sources are, we'll have a much better picture of what we need to build for our organization to systematically mitigate those risks. Thanks so much.
I think we might have just enough time for a question or two.
Who do you think is the right owner inside the companies for this? I mean, is this something else to go on the plate of the chief data and analytics officer? I'm looking at one right now. Or is this more a legal compliance function? Yeah, who's the right owner?
No, I think it should be someone on the tech side of the house. It's standardly a chief data officer, analytics officer, data analytics officer, chief information officer, chief technology officer. That's standardly who it is. And that to me makes a lot of sense because there are some real technical stuff that's going on, and you need the technical people to own the program. It needs to be very, very senior level, though. They need buy-in from the board and other members of the C-suite, frankly. But yeah, I think it should be so. Legal needs to be involved, compliance needs to be involved, but I don't think they should own it because they don't really understand the technology deeply enough. They need a lot of education and training. They ought to get that so that they can work with the technologists. But I think someone on the tech side of the house needs to own it. I'll say maybe one last quick thing. The this is just the beginning of the AI stuff, all you data scientists, right? There's lots of other technologies that are here / coming down the pipeline. And those are going to be also uses of blockchain outside of the crypto space. Quantum computers are going to pour gasoline on the black box problem. More kinds of technologies are coming down the pipeline. They're getting integrated with AI. And so it's going to get really messy, which is another reason why you want the technologists leading the charge here.
So given that we can build AI model to achieve any objective, right? What stops us from building an AI model for ethics, like just have specific model for identifying ethical gaps and which runs on every model?
Yeah.
Could we get to that stage?
I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical. You could probably have something. I mean, there's interesting examples of you feel like LLMs, quote unquote, arguing with each other, right? It can give you reasons for positions. I've tried it. It doesn't do a good job. A year from now, 10 years from now, maybe it does do a really good job. So I suppose I have no principled objection to such a thing. The question is whether the tech is where it needs to be in order to systematically spot those things. One reason for being skeptical is that harming people or wronging people is very context sensitive. And it's hard to see how an LLM is going to get a good grip on the ethical, the context, and not just the context generally, but what features of the context are ethically salient, are ethically relevant. And determining what's ethically relevant and irrelevant is not easy. So for instance, sometimes, you went first last time is a good reason why it's the next person's turn. Other times that's not a good reason because they went first, because they need to go first, because they're, I don't know, let's say it's a race and that person going first because of their skill sets, they ought to go first, whatever. So, because sometimes taking turns is the right thing to do, and sometimes it would be a disaster. It's not obvious how LLMs are going to get that kind of context sensitivity. I'm choosing sort of a silly case, but yeah. So again, in principle, sure. In practice, I just don't see the technology being anywhere near there yet.
Reid, thank you very much for your time and advice, and you are still the ethicist I trust the most on,
Oh, good.
on the topic of responsible AI.
Thanks so much, everyone.